Hey everybody, Jem Schofield here, and welcome to the Canon EOS R5 and R6 video training series. The purpose of this series is to focus on the video capabilities of these cameras. And in this particular video, it's all about post-production with a core focus on the R5 and working with 8K RAW, but we'll also be talking about working with Canon Log on the camera, and some of that data will apply to the R6 as well. So let's get started. Before we jump into the various applications and talk about workflows, I do want to mention that there's an evolution here in terms of support, both with the cameras and your software solutions. Currently, I'm using the first firmware that this camera shipped with, and that does not include at this time the now announced future firmware update, which will add Canon Log 3 and will also add a lower bitrate option for 8K RAW. In addition, Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve, Final Cut Pro 10, they will evolve. They will have new versions with better support for the camera and its formats. As it is right now, we can work with all of the formats in all of those applications, but with a few caveats, with a couple of gotchas that I'm going to make you aware of. Also, media and media management is very important. Make sure that you have fast card readers for your CF Express and your SD cards. And then from an editorial standpoint, when you're working in post-production, make sure that you have fast SSD drives, especially if you're working on a slightly older system and you're not working off of your internal drive, which most people are not. It will make a big difference when you're working with these higher bit or data rates and these larger files, whether you're working with 8K RAW, All-I, or IPB. There's still a lot of processing that's needed here. So it's going to be important that you're set up the right way to work with the footage from the camera. So what I want to do first is jump into DaVinci Resolve, and we'll take a look at 8K RAW, and we'll also take a look at Canon Log and get some understanding of how it all works. And then we'll jump into Premiere Pro and Final Cut Pro 10. So let's start with 8K RAW in DaVinci Resolve. And you can see here in terms of media, I've loaded up some CRM or Canon RAW files into the app. And then if we take a look here, I have those clips inside of the timeline, and we will bounce over to color to take a look at our options. Now, it's important when you're working with 8K RAW that you set up your project the way you want it to be set up in terms of your project settings. So right now, for what we're doing, I'm actually matching my timeline settings to the resolution that we captured, 8K DCI, which is 8192 by 4320. But of course, if you wanted to work with this footage in a 4K timeline, you could set that to 4K DCI, 4096 by 2160, or UHD 4K, 3840 by 2160. So we've got that set up. And the key to the castle when you're working with RAW is hopefully having access to those RAW settings from the camera. At the moment, DaVinci Resolve is going to give you the most control working with those files. So we're going to go down here to Camera RAW, but we do have to make some changes. And the problem here is, at least currently, when the CRM files are coming in from the R5, they're being interpreted as Cinema Raw Lite files, and that's a format that is recording to cameras like the C200, the C300 Mark III, the C500 Mark II, but it is not the type of RAW that's being recorded by the R5. So if you take a look down here, you'll actually see that what it's doing is it's trying to match what it would think would be coming in for Cinema Raw Lite. So we're going to make some changes here. So we're going to go down to decode quality and choose full res Canon. I'm going to decode using the particular clip that I have chosen here. And then it's going to start to open up some options for me. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set this up to match the way I was capturing in camera. This particular clip, even though it was captured in 8K RAW, was not captured with HDR PQ turned on or Canon Log turned on. So I was using the picture styles, which is 709 in terms of gamut and gamma. So what I want to do is choose color space, Rec 709. I want to choose gamma, Rec 709, and you'll see that that's a pretty drastic change there. I do have the option here, if I want to change the ISO. So because it's RAW, it does give me that control. And then I have these additional Canon RAW controls here that will allow me to change things like the color temperature. I can adjust my highlights inside of the image, my shadows, and adjust those. And then of course, when I feel like I have the image where I want it to be, in terms of a starting point, then I can go over here and start working with my color wheels. Now, you may find that for yourself that you're only making adjustments over here in this left-hand column, and you're not actually making any changes over here to Canon RAW, but you do have that capability here when you're working in Resolve. Let's go ahead and take a look at another clip, and when I load that up, very similar. The difference is that this was shot using Canon Log. So I'm going to go decode quality, full res Canon. We're going to say clip. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to now change this to the color space that I was capturing in, which was Rec. 709. And this is a little bit different. I captured with Canon Log, but based on the tests that we've been doing, we've been finding that the transform is more accurate when you use Canon Log 3 as your gamma curve in terms of where the midtones fall inside of the image. Now, as I said before, in the future and in the future firmware update, there's going to be Canon Log 3 added to the R5. So I think that this will be a workflow that you'll be looking at in the future. This is a great way to take a look at how working in RAW gives you a lot of power and flexibility. So you can see here, if I adjust that, we still have all of that information inside of the image because that's just metadata when we work with RAW. RAW is not a video file. It's essentially zeros and ones. It's the signal that's being captured from the camera. And when we can access ISO controls, it does give us a lot more flexibility. Now, because this was shot using Canon Log, I could, as an option here, instead of going over here to my color wheels, I could start by adding a LUT. I can go over here to the node and apply it. And I could also go over here and we'll just take a look. We can click on our LUTs and we can see our various LUTs. I've loaded a couple of LUTs in here that are from Canon. And in this case, we could choose, let's say, for instance, the BT709 Canon Log LUT, which will convert to 709 and YDR is the gamma. And you can see what happens when I apply that to the image. But remember, anything that I'm doing is based on what I've already done here under Camera Raw. So your order of operations are basically based on that. You can, if you want, try other LUTs that are available inside of here to see how they work. But you will find that based on the sensors in the cameras and the LUT that you choose, they may not give you the same types of results because they're designed for a different curve, for different gamuts, and different workflows. So when I apply, for instance, a red LUT, or I apply an Olympus LUT, we're not going to get the same results that we're going to get when we apply the Canon LUT. And again, this is going to have to do with your workflow. You could also go in and turn that LUT off, of course, and then just go with that particular workflow. And then we have one other clip right here that you can see. And again, same workflow. If I'm working with this and log footage, I'm going to go ahead and choose full Canon. I'm going to say clip, and then I'm going to change to the color space that I recorded in. I'm going to, in this case, change to Canon Log 3 so my midtones fall where they should. And then I can start by applying a LUT, or I can go over here to my color wheels and start to adjust the image there. And so you have, again, a tremendous amount of flexibility inside of DaVinci Resolve. Now, the last thing I want to do is just show you and work with a clip that's not in 8K RAW. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So now I've loaded up a different project inside of Resolve, and the big difference here is we're not working with 8K RAW. We're working with an MP4 file from the camera. If we take a look at the metadata over here, we can see that it's H.265, in this case 23.976, and we're shooting in UHD 4K. Now, at this current time, and this may carry forward or not, depending on how they update the software, you will need DaVinci Resolve Studio to work with these types of files. So the 8K RAW files will work in DaVinci Resolve and DaVinci Resolve Studio, but these H.265 MP4 files need Studio to actually work with them. We've got a clip here. I've added that to the timeline, and then we'll go back over to color. The big difference is there's no camera raw options because we are not recording in RAW. And if I go over here, we have a couple of different workflows. I can start to work with this clip with my color wheels and all of the other tools that are inside of Resolve. And I can access my LUTs, and we can use that as a starting point. Now again, inside of the camera, I was shooting with Canon Log and Rec. 709 in terms of the color space. So I'm going to use this particular LUT and double click on it and apply it to the image, and you're going to see the changes there. And if I just bring up, just so that we can see it, our waveform monitor and we take a look at our scopes, we can see what that LUT is doing. And again, let's just take a look and see that it is being applied over here with our nodes. There's the no LUT image, and we can just apply that LUT that I loaded into Resolve, and we can see what's happening there. So there you go. You can see here that we can make those adjustments to the image. And while not quite as flexible as working with the 8K RAW files, many people are going to be shooting in UHD 4K with this camera or 4K DCI, and they're going to be shooting in log. So this would be more typical of working with the footage off the camera when you're not using 8K RAW. So that should give you a good overview of how to work with the files from the R5 in DaVinci Resolve, obviously 8K RAW, and then also working with those H.265 files in Resolve Studio. I'm sure we'll see updates to the application, and we will be getting that Canon Log 3 in the future in the camera, so that will help immensely in terms of overall workflow. Let's go ahead now and jump into Premiere Pro. All right, so here we are in Premiere Pro, and we can take a look first at this timeline for the 8K RAW files, just dropped right in. And we've got those same clips that we had before inside of here. And what we're gonna do is take a look at the controls inside of Premiere Pro. So I'm gonna hop over here to the effect controls and go over here to master. And this is where we find our RAW controls. And just like in Resolve, at least with this current build, it's interpreting that Canon RAW as Cinema Raw Light. So it's immediately throwing the color space into Cinema Gamut. It's taking the gamma and putting that into Canon Log 2. If you watch the beginning part in Resolve, you'll know that this particular clip was recorded in a BT709 color space using Picture Styles, the neutral one. And also the gamma was set to BT709. So we weren't using log at all for this particular clip. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is the controls that we have access to are a little bit different inside of Premiere Pro, and we don't have that same granular control over the RAW file that we had inside of Resolve. So we can go in here and we can make an overall exposure adjustment, but we're not accessing our ISO from the camera here. And again, that's just gonna limit how much you can do with the RAW file before you start going into other controls when you want to adjust the image. And then I can go over here and start to take a look at my Lumetri controls. And really, at this point, for this particular clip, I wouldn't start with a LUT-based workflow because of the way the image was captured. I'd probably go down into and start to work with the color wheels. And then, of course, as we start to make adjustments, those will show up over here under the effects controls as well if we want to use the controls over on this side of the app. And of course, as you know, with Premiere Pro, it's completely modular in terms of your workspace. And that's basically how we would start to work with that clip. Now we'll jump to that second clip, and if you remember that second clip, going over here to master, we can see the controls again, and because it's interpreting it as Cinema Raw Light, again, color space, Cinema Gamut, we shot with 709, and then our choices here do not include Canon Log, unfortunately. So what you're gonna have to do is do some tests. Again, like in Resolve, it seems like our midtones are falling into place in a better way, setting this to Canon Log 3 if we're going into these controls. And then what we can do is we can start to adjust our exposure here. So with that adjustment, we can take a look at our scopes and we can see where the image is falling. And then I could go over here and start working with wheels and things like that. But I do want to talk about LUTs or lookup tables. I've actually loaded up those Canon LUTs into here. And the main thing to be aware of course, and we've talked about this now before, is that if we're flagging this as a gamma of Canon Log 3, and then we're applying a LUT that's based on Canon Log, then your results may be a little bit different inside of here. So again, looking forward to the Canon Log 3 upgrade inside of the camera, because I think that workflow will make this a lot easier, but also hopefully updates in terms of the way that RAW file is being interpreted by Premiere Pro in the future. So that's the LUT on. And no LUT, of course, we can go into Lumetri and we can go into Creative, and you have all of those looks that can also be applied to your footage. And that's really going to have to do with your workflow and what you want to do, but that's basically how you're working with those files. I'm also just going to go ahead and jump over here to a different project that we had looked at inside of Resolve, which is our 4K UHD footage in H.265. And of course, because this is not RAW, but it was shot in log, we do not have those RAW controls inside of here. So we basically just have to know what the footage is that we have coming in. Now in this situation, we know that we shot in Canon Log and Rec. 709, so we can go over here to our input LUTs, go and find that LUT that I loaded in here where we shot in BT 709 and Canon Log in camera. And then basically what we're doing is we're using the LUT to go to a 709 and a wide dynamic range. And you can see there's that. And then if I go into my wheels or wherever I want to adjust the image and I start to make some adjustments, because my image was exposed correctly in production, I still have all of that information there that I can start to work with the image. And that can be the starting point to working with it inside of your application. So as of right now, that's the basic workflow inside of Premiere Pro when working with footage from the camera. Of course, when we talk about a Canon Log workflow, that can apply to the R6 as well. So now let's quickly jump into Final Cut Pro 10 and look at working with the footage in that application. Now we're going to take a look at Final Cut Pro 10 and working with these files, but it's important to note that you will need a plugin to work with the CRM files from the R5. So you're going to go to Canon's website to drivers and downloads, and then under software, scroll down and find the latest version of the Canon RAW plugin for Final Cut Pro 10. It may be a newer version than what I'm using right now. This is 1.5, but you would download and install that plugin and then go over to Final Cut Pro 10 with that installed, and it will recognize these CRM files coming off of the camera. Now I'm currently running 10.4.8 in terms of Final Cut Pro 10, and that version is compatible with the Canon RAW plugin 1.5. So just make sure that your plugin and your version of Final Cut is compatible with these files. So now we're in Final Cut and we're taking a look at these clips in an 8K timeline. And you'll see over here in the inspector that when I brought the clips in, because of the way I have Final Cut set up, it will apply an appropriate LUT to the footage if it recognizes a particular file format. And it's looking at this in a very similar way to Premiere Pro and Resolve, and it's trying to apply, in this case, a LUT that's based on Canon Log 2 and Cinema Gamut. So because this first clip was not shot in Canon Log, I definitely want to turn this LUT off. If I had a Rec. 709 to Rec. 709 based LUT, I could apply that, but I don't have that right now. And again, because I didn't shoot in Canon Log, I'm going to turn the LUT off. And then what I can do is I can go in and start adjusting the image. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn on what I had done with the color wheels. And essentially, I had boosted saturation in my midtones, shadows, and highlights. And you can adjust those based on where you want them to be. So generally what I'm trying to do when I'm exposing for an image, whether it's in RAW or I'm using just straight log in a video format, is I'm trying to adjust the image down, not up. So what we're doing over here with the wheels, this is just saturation, but you can see I'm bringing my shadows down. I have my midtones here. We can go ahead and take a look at our scopes, and you can see where the scopes are falling, and you can adjust the image to where you want it to be. And of course, we're adjusting this image to the style and what we're looking for in this final footage. But that's one way that we could adjust that. Let's just go ahead and jump over here, and you can see that it's also being interpreted as Canon Log 2 and Cinema Gamut. So I'm actually going to load a LUT up here, which I've used in the other apps as well, which I downloaded from Canon's website, and apply that. And that's the LUT that's basically saying I shot with the camera in BT709 and Canon Log, and I'm converting it to BT709 in terms of color space and wide dynamic range to protect those highlights. And then I would start to adjust that image to where I want it to fall overall in terms of my shadows, midtones, and highlights, or lift, gamma, gain, and we can start to work with the file like that. Now I'm going to go ahead and double click on a different project timeline here, which is the 4K UHD timeline. That's the clip we were looking at before. I'm going to bounce over here to my inspector again. Now, because this footage is not log, it's not automatically applying a LUT to it. So if I wanted to, I could apply a LUT as a starting point when I start working with this image, and you can see that change. Or I could start to work with it without a LUT, and I could just go over here and just start adjusting the image, or you could do a combination of both. So I'll go over here and apply that camera LUT based on the way I shot with the camera, and then we start making adjustments to that file to where we want these parts of the image to fall. And again, exposure in production is so important. We want to make sure that if at all possible, A, we're not clipping highlights if it is possible to not do that. Sometimes you've got that sun in the frame and it's going to clip. And secondly, it's about adjusting the image down as opposed to lifting the image up, because generally when you're lifting, especially those shadows in your final image, you will start to see noise in that part of your image. So try to expose so you can adjust down, and as best as possible, try not to clip those highlights. So that's the basic current workflow inside of Final Cut Pro 10, working with both the Canon RAW files from this camera, the 8K RAW files, and also working with the H.264 files in the MP4 format. So there you have it. That's a brief overview of post-production workflows using footage from the Canon R5, 8K RAW, and Canon Log footage. Of course, the Canon Log data also applies to the R6. And as things evolve, both with the cameras in terms of firmware and with the software solutions that you're using in post-production, it will get easier. We're going to be getting Canon Log 3 in the R5 in the future. There's going to be a lower bitrate option for 8K RAW, which will also make things easier for certain people on their systems. And then, of course, the software solutions will evolve for these new cameras as well. Stick with it, and hopefully this data helps you. The goal, as always, is education, so I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.